the first time Georgia Winslow noticed Joel Archer. She was standing in the middle of Caldwell, Kansas, in the summer of 1883, covered from collar to boot in red dust from 3 days of hard travel, holding a carpetbag in one hand and a letter of introduction in the other. And every single soul on that main street had already decided something about her. She could feel it the way you feel weather changing, in the skin, in the back of the neck, in the particular way silence moved around a person like water around a stone. The women on the boardwalk had pursed their lips and looked sideways at each other, communicating entire conversations without words. The men at the hitching post had straightened up and let their eyes travel the full length of her in a way that made her feel both overexposed and invisible at the same time. Even the boy sweeping dust off the mercantile steps had paused to stare with his mouth slightly open, as though she were something washed up by a river that had no business being there. Georgia Winslow was used to this. She had been used to it since she was 16 years old and her mother had died and left her alone in St. Louis with nothing but a fine face, a sharp tongue, and a reputation she had never quite earned but had never quite been able to shake either. She had learned to walk through it the way you walk through cold water, quickly, with your chin up, and without flinching, even when every instinct told you to fold in half and disappear. She was 26 now, and she had come to Caldwell because her cousin Margaret had written her a letter in March saying that there was a position available as a school teacher, and that the town was growing fast, and that people were decent enough if you gave them time to warm up. Georgia had read the word decent and felt something hopeful stir in her chest, which she supposed was the most dangerous thing a practical woman could allow herself to feel. She had the letter and she had the carpetbag, and she had $32 sewn into the lining of her second-best petticoat, and she was standing in the middle of the street trying to remember which direction her cousin had said the boarding house was when she became aware of a man watching her from the doorway of the livery stable across the road. He was not watching her the way the others were. He was leaning with one shoulder against the doorframe, arms crossed loosely over his chest, hat pulled low against the afternoon sun, and he was watching her the way you watch something you are genuinely trying to understand, with patience, with something that might have been curiosity, with absolutely no trace of judgment that she could detect. His expression was not closed or hostile, but it was also not the soft, avid, calculating look she had come to recognize so well in men who had already decided she was something to be acquired or dismissed. He simply looked at her as though he had not yet made up his mind about anything. Georgia stood there with the dust settling around her boots and held that gaze for 3 full seconds before she made herself look away, because it was that gaze, not the unkind ones, not the greedy ones, that was the most disorienting thing she had encountered in a very long time. She walked in the direction she hoped was the boarding house, and told herself firmly that she had not come to Caldwell to be disoriented by a man in a livery doorway. She had come to teach school, and that was the whole of it. The boarding house was run by a woman named Alma Bridger, who was 53 years old, wide through the shoulders, and possessed of the particular brand of warmth that comes wrapped in a great deal of common sense. She had a room available on the 2nd floor with a window that faced east, which she said was better for sleeping in the summer because the afternoon heat came from the west, and she charged $2 a week with meals included on the condition that Georgia helped clear the breakfast table before she left for the schoolhouse each morning. Georgia agreed to all of this without hesitation, because Alma Bridger looked at her with sharp eyes that were measuring but not unkind, and that was about as good as Georgia had learned to expect. She was shown the room, which was small and clean, and had a patchwork quilt on the iron-framed bed that someone had made with real care, the kind of careful stitching that spoke of long winter evenings and patience. Georgia set her carpetbag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed and let out a breath she had been holding for approximately the last 200 miles. Caldwell, Kansas, was a cattle town. It sat at the edge of Indian Territory on the Kishom Trail, which meant that every summer the streets filled up with cowboys who had driven longhorns up from Texas and were looking for somewhere to spend their wages and let loose a few months of trail dust. The town itself had ambitions. There was a newspaper, 3 churches, a proper courthouse under construction, and the school where Georgia would be teaching, which had been built the previous year and had 31 students ranging from 6 to 14 years old. Georgia knew all of this from Margaret's letters. What the letters had not prepared her for was the particular quality of the place. The way the prairie stretched out flat and enormous in every direction, so that the sky felt impossibly large and close at the same time. The way the wind moved through the grass in long golden waves that were almost hypnotic. The way the town seemed to exist in a permanent state of becoming, as though everything in it was still in the process of deciding what it was going to be. She found that she liked it, despite herself. She started teaching on a Monday, and by Tuesday afternoon she had learned the names and particular quirks of all 31 students, established that she would not tolerate cruelty between children, but would tolerate a great deal of noise provided it was the noise of learning, and sent 2 of the older boys home with notes for their parents informing them that their sons were perfectly clever and had clearly not been challenged enough, which Georgia suspected was the root of their habit of drawing unflattering pictures of the schoolmarm in the margins of their McGuffey readers. She also discovered, by Tuesday morning, that the town of Caldwell had opinions about her that were already as fully formed as geological features, as solid and unmovable as the limestone bluffs she had passed on the way in. She heard the fragments through the thin walls of the boarding house, through the way conversations in the general store quieted when she walked in, through the carefully composed expressions of the school board members who came by to observe her first week of classes. She had been called handsome, which in the mouth of a certain kind of woman meant she was too aware of it. She had been called forward, which meant she had answered a direct question with a direct answer without first qualifying it with 3 layers of apology. She had been called independent, which meant she had arrived alone and seemed comfortable with her own company. She had been called a city woman, which meant she did not yet know anyone's grandmother's name. She was used to all of these things. She had a method for them. The method was to be so thoroughly competent and so quietly warm with the children and so patient with the parents and so consistent in her behavior that eventually the opinions would soften at the edges, even if they never entirely dissolved. It took time. It always took time. She was willing to spend the time. What she had not expected was the man from the livery doorway. His name was Joel Archer, and she learned it 3 days after she arrived, when Alma Bridger mentioned him over the supper table in that particular offhand way that meant she was actually watching to see how Georgia would react. Alma said he had come to Caldwell about a year ago from somewhere in Wyoming, that he ran the livery stable and was very good with horses, that he was quiet and kept to himself, and that he was reliable in the particular way of men who showed up when they said they would and did not make promises they could not keep. Georgia said that sounded like a useful quality in a man who ran a livery stable, and Alma smiled into her corn bread and changed the subject. Georgia told herself she was not curious about Joel Archer. She told herself this with great conviction every morning for the next week and a half, which was approximately how long it took before she spoke to him directly. It happened because of a horse. One of her students, a 9-year-old boy named Robert Hatch, who was the kind of child that made Georgia believe that human beings were fundamentally good despite all available evidence to the contrary, had found a horse standing in a ditch at the edge of town on a Thursday afternoon. The horse had a badly cut leg and was clearly in distress, and Robert, being Robert, had stayed with it instead of going home, which meant that by the time Georgia finished her paperwork at the schoolhouse and walked past the north end of town on her way back to Alma's, there was a small, worried boy crouched beside an injured horse in the failing light, and Georgia had no idea what to do about either of them. She knew the general principle of horses the way a city woman knows the general principle of thunderstorms, intellectually, at a respectful distance, with a clear awareness that she was not in charge here. She knew, however, that the livery stable was 3 blocks south. She left Robert with the horse, which seemed calmer with him there than it would have been with her, and walked to the livery stable and found Joel Archer in the last stall, finishing up the evening feeding. He was taller than she had registered from across the street, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of easy physical competence that comes from a life of actual work rather than the performance of it. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway and did not look startled, which was itself unusual, since Georgia was generally aware that her arrivals had a tendency to startle people. She said, "There is an injured horse in the ditch on the north end of Maple Street, and a boy who found it and won't leave it. I don't know what to do about the horse's leg. I thought you might." Joel Archer looked at her for a moment with that same quality of attention she had noticed before, measuring, careful, entirely without the overlay of prior conclusion. Then he set down the feed bucket, said, "Show me," and pulled on his coat, and that was the whole of their introduction. He was good with the horse. Georgia watched him work in the dimming light, watched the way he moved slowly and spoke in a low, steady voice, and she had the thought that some people had a particular gift for calming frightened things, and that this was perhaps the most underrated gift there was. The horse's leg was cut but not broken. Joel cleaned the wound with water from his canteen and material from a small kit he had brought in the saddlebag. He had slung over his shoulder with the unhurried foresight of a man who had done this before, and he wrapped it with practiced efficiency. Robert Hatch watched all of this with enormous eyes, asking careful, intelligent questions that Joel answered with the same straightforward respect he would have given to an adult. Georgia stood a little to the side and thought about how rarely she had seen grown men speak to children, as though the children's questions deserved full and honest answers. When the horse was tended to, Joel stood up and dusted off his knees and told Robert that the horse was going to be all right, but that someone would need to come and move it to the stable for the night, and that someone would need to find out who the horse belonged to, and that he would take care of both of those things if Robert wanted to go home before full dark. Robert thanked him with the grave courtesy of a boy who had been raised by someone who took manners seriously, and then looked at Georgia with slightly less certainty, because Robert Hatch was 9 years old and Georgia Winslow was his teacher, and she was currently standing in a ditch with hay in her hair, which did not quite fit any of the categories he had established for teachers. Georgia said, "Good night, Robert. You did a good thing staying with him," and Robert nodded seriously and went home, and then it was just Georgia and Joel Archer in the ditch with the injured horse between them. "Thank you," she said. "It's no trouble," he said. There was a pause that was not exactly uncomfortable, which Georgia found interesting because she was not accustomed to pauses with strangers being anything other than uncomfortable. She said, "You're Joel Archer. You run the livery." He said, "That's right, and you're the new school teacher." She said, "Georgia Winslow," because she had always believed in giving people her name as soon as possible, partly from habit and partly because it forced the conversation to become specific rather than general, and she vastly preferred specific. He said, "Joel Archer," and something in the way he said it was just the return of the introduction, simple and direct, without the performance of interest that men so often put into the first exchange of names with a woman they had decided they were going to be interested in. She thought, "Here is a man who has not yet decided anything about me." She found this remarkable. And then, as the thought settled, she found it terrifying, because she had built an entire architecture of survival around knowing what people had decided, around reading the shape of the judgment and finding the best angle to navigate it. The absence of it was like reaching for a wall in the dark and finding nothing. She said good night and walked back to the boarding house, and she thought about Joel Archer with considerably more attention than she had intended to give him. She learned things about him gradually, the way you learn things in a small town, through the accumulated sediment of other people's passing remarks, through observation, through the particular way a place shapes itself around a person's presence. She learned that he was 31 years old, that he had come to Caldwell after spending several years in Wyoming working on a cattle ranch, that he was the kind of quiet that came from preference rather than shyness, and that he had a particular reputation in Caldwell for being both very fair in his dealings and very difficult to read. This last part she recognized immediately as the reputation of a man who did not react to situations the way other people expected him to, which was the reputation she would have predicted for a man who looked at the world with his kind of deliberate, unhurried attention. She saw him most mornings from the window of the boarding house, across the street and 2 lots down, opening the livery stable for the day. She saw him on Sundays at church, where he sat near the back and listened to Reverend Pruitt's sermons with the expression of someone genuinely considering the ideas rather than just waiting for it to be over, which Georgia appreciated even from across the aisle. She occasionally passed him on the street between the schoolhouse and the boarding house, and they nodded to each other, and once or twice exchanged a few words about the weather or the state of the road, which in Caldwell in the summer of 1883 was genuinely interesting as a topic, because it had not rained properly in 6 weeks, and everyone was concerned about it. She was aware, in those weeks, of the town's opinions continuing to form themselves around her like sediment. She was aware that some of the school board members had reservations about a single woman of her age and with her particular history, which had followed her from St. Louis in the form of a rumor that had arrived approximately 3 weeks before she did, and which she could see in the careful, measured politeness of certain women in certain circles. She was aware that she was being evaluated constantly, that every decision she made was being observed and interpreted through a lens she had not chosen and could not entirely control. She had been through this before. She held herself together with the particular dignity of a woman who had learned that dignity was sometimes the only thing entirely your own. What she had not anticipated was the supper invitation. Alma Bridger had a habit on the last Friday of each month of hosting a supper for people she considered neighbors in the widest possible sense of the word, which in Alma's vocabulary apparently included anyone within a half-mile radius who she thought could benefit from a decent meal and some conversation. Georgia had been there for one of these suppers already the previous month and had found it unexpectedly pleasant, because Alma chose her guests with the instinct of someone who understood that interesting conversation required people who did not all see the world the same way. This month's gathering included Joel Archer. He arrived exactly when he had said he would, which Georgia had already come to understand was simply how he operated in every situation. He was clean from the livery work, wearing a dark coat, and he brought Alma a small paper parcel of cinnamon that he said he had gotten from the dry goods store when they had unexpectedly gotten a new shipment in, and that he thought she might like it. Alma received this with the satisfied expression of a woman whose read on a person had been confirmed. Georgia was already at the table, sitting across from Reverend Pruitt's wife, Ellen, who was kind and chatty, and had been making a genuine effort to include Georgia in the life of the community, in the particular way of women, who understand that exclusion is a form of cruelty even when it is passive. Georgia watched Joel come in and sit down and settle into the room with the ease of a man who was comfortable with himself in most situations, which was, she thought, an underrated quality. The supper was roast chicken and root vegetables and Alma's extraordinary corn bread, and the conversation moved with the easy warmth of people who have agreed to be interested in each other for the duration of the meal. Reverend Pruitt was there, a thin man of enormous intellectual enthusiasm who had passionate opinions about irrigation systems, which in a Kansas summer were not actually irrelevant, and Alma's neighbor Mr. Goss, who was a retired army man and very funny about it, and the newspaper editor, a woman named Hazel Drew who had come out from Ohio 10 years ago and had apparently caused at least as much speculation upon her arrival as Georgia was currently causing. Hazel Drew caught Georgia's eye across the table at one point and gave her a small, private smile that said very clearly, "I know exactly what you are going through, and you are going to be fine." Georgia found this profoundly reassuring. The conversation drifted, as conversations at Alma's suppers apparently always did, through irrigation and cattle prices and the question of whether Caldwell was going to expand its courthouse before winter or wait until spring, and at some point it arrived at the school. Reverend Prout said that he had heard wonderful things about Georgia's teaching methods from several parents, and said it with such genuine warmth that Georgia felt the familiar tightness in her chest ease slightly, because she had been so carefully tending to her professional reputation, and it was gratifying to know it was being received. Mr. Goss asked what she thought of Caldwell, and she said she thought it was a place that knew exactly what it wanted to be and was working very hard toward it, which made Alma laugh and Hazel nod approvingly. Then Hazel asked Joel Archer what he thought of the town's chances for the proposed railroad spur that everyone had been discussing, and Joel said he thought there was a reasonable chance if the cattle business held up, but that he had learned to be careful about holding too strong an opinion on things that depended on too many factors outside anyone's control. Georgia said before she had fully decided to say it, "That seems like a useful philosophy," and he looked at her across the table with that same quality of attention and said, "I think so, though I suspect most people find it frustrating." She said, "Most people prefer strong opinions. It makes conversation easier." He said, "Easier isn't always better." There was a pause in the larger conversation around them, not the silence of people not knowing what to say, but the silence of people who had registered that two other people were saying something worth listening to. Then Reverend Prout said something about the irrigation system again, and the moment dissolved. But Georgia was aware of having said a real thing to another person who had said a real thing back, and she held it carefully for the rest of the meal. Afterward, when Alma's guests were filing out into the warm August evening, Joel Archer said good night to Georgia with her name in it, which was simple and ordinary except that most people in town still called her Miss Winslow in that particular tone that kept a careful distance intact. And she went upstairs to her room and sat by the east-facing window in the heat and felt the terrifying, remarkable thing that had been building in her since the ditch on Maple Street beginning to clarify itself into something she recognized. She was going to have to be very careful. The opinion, the single, unprecedented thing of being with someone who had not yet formed one about her, was so fragile and so valuable that she was afraid of what she might do to preserve it, and equally afraid of what would happen if she simply let herself respond to it honestly. September arrived with a drop in temperature that everyone in Caldwell received like a gift, and the town exhaled its long summer tension and became almost tender with relief. The cattle drives were winding down for the season, the cowboys heading back south or settling in for the winter, the saloons quieting from their summer roar to a more manageable murmur. Georgia's school had settled into the comfortable rhythm of established routine, which she loved, the particular pleasure of 31 children who now knew her well enough to relax into genuine learning rather than the performance of it. Robert Hatch had become a particular favorite, not because she played favorites, but because Robert had a quality of mind that reminded her so much of herself at 9 that she sometimes had to turn away from the window so the other children would not see the expression on her face. She had also, over the course of August, had 6 more conversations with Joel Archer of the kind that mattered, conversations that went past the surface of weather and town business into the underneath of things, into what people actually thought about the way the world worked, and what they had come from, and what they hoped was possible. These conversations happened most naturally at Alma's table, but also once on the street, when they had both stopped at the same moment to watch a magnificent electrical storm build itself on the western horizon, and had stood side by side in silence for a while before either of them found the right words for what they were looking at. And once in the general store where they had ended up on the same side of a question about whether it was the responsibility of people who had more to help people who had less, and had discovered that they agreed completely. She did not allow herself to call this courtship. It was two people who found each other interesting, and she held it at exactly that. But she noticed things. She noticed that she was more careful about what she wore on Sundays. She noticed that she took the slightly longer route home from school on the days when she knew he would be working outside the stable in the afternoon. She noticed that she thought about things she wanted to tell him, small observations about the day, moments of unexpected beauty or strangeness. And this was the clearest signal of all, because she had learned a long time ago that the person you want to tell things to is the person who matters. She was terrified of it. She was terrified specifically because the absence of his performed opinion meant that any opinion he eventually formed would be formed entirely on the basis of who she actually was, and she was not at all certain she could withstand being known so directly. It was much easier to navigate a judgment that had already been established, to find the edges, to work around it, to present the parts of herself that contradicted the worst of it. Being looked at with genuinely open eyes by someone who might then look away, that was the most frightening thing she had encountered in years. The crisis came in late September, and it came from the direction she had least expected. Her cousin Margaret, who had written the letter about the school position, and who lived on the far side of town with her husband, Tom, and their 3 children, came to see Georgia on a Wednesday afternoon, ostensibly to bring her a jar of preserved peaches, but actually Georgia understood within 30 seconds to warn her about something. Margaret sat down at Alma's kitchen table. Alma had tactfully gone out to check on her garden, and said, with the particular expression of a woman who is about to say something she does not want to have to say, that there was talk going around town, that there were people on the school board who had received a letter from someone in St. Louis. That the letter said things about Georgia that were not, Margaret emphasized, things that anyone with any sense would believe for a moment, but that the school board was a collection of people not all of whom were possessed of unlimited sense, and that there was going to be a meeting next week at which Georgia's position might be discussed. Georgia sat very still and felt the familiar cold drop in her stomach that this particular news always produced, and said, "What kind of things?" Margaret, who loved Georgia and had loved her since they were girls, said carefully, "Things about a man in St. Louis. Someone who used to be involved with you, who apparently has not gotten over the fact that you left, and who has decided that the best response to this is to write letters to people in whatever town you happen to be living in." Georgia said nothing for a moment. She looked at the jar of preserved peaches on the table between them, which Alma grew in the small orchard behind the house, and which were some of the best peaches Georgia had ever eaten. She said, "His name is Franklin Holt, and the things he says are not true," and she said it with the flat, factual certainty of a woman who has had to say this sentence before. Margaret said, "I know that, I know you. Tell me what you need." What Georgia needed was complicated, and she spent the rest of that evening and most of that night working out what shape the complication actually took. She needed to be at the school board meeting and to conduct herself with absolute steadiness. She needed to know what specifically was in the letter. She needed to think about whether she was going to leave Caldwell before they could dismiss her, which was her first instinct because it had been her method before, or whether she was going to stay and fight, which was her second instinct and which felt more frightening and more true. She went to school the next morning and taught her 31 students with the full force of her attention and the full warmth of her care, because whatever happened in the next week, today these children were her students and they deserved her best. She was walking home in the early afternoon, a half-day because the oldest students had been kept back to practice their arithmetic with a student teacher from the county, when she encountered Joel Archer at the corner of Main and 2nd Street, and she understood from the way he looked at her that he had already heard something. She stopped. She said, "You've heard about the letter." He said, "I heard something this morning." She said, "I imagine you've formed an opinion." He looked at her for a long moment in that careful way, and then he said, "I don't form opinions about people from letters other people write about them." She felt the sentence land somewhere in the center of her chest with a weight that was almost physical. She said quietly, "That's a very unusual position." He said, "I've found that most people are more complicated than whatever story someone else tells about them. That seems especially true for people other people want to have strong opinions about." She stood there on the corner of Main and Second and felt something move through her that she had not felt in a very long time, something that was not hope exactly, because hope was too soft, but was more like the moment before hope, the recognition that hope might be possible. She said, "His name is Franklin Holt. He's a merchant in St. Louis. I worked for his family as a tutor for 2 years. He decided he wanted to marry me. I decided I did not want to marry him. He has apparently not recovered his equanimity on the subject." Joel said nothing, just listened. She said, "There is nothing in the letter that is true in any factual sense, though I imagine there are things in it that he believes are true, which is a different kind of problem." Joel said, "What are you going to do?" She said, "I'm going to the school board meeting on Monday and I'm going to explain myself. After that, I don't know." He said, "Would it help to have someone who could speak to what they've observed of you directly, rather than what some letter says?" She looked at him very carefully. She said, "That would be a significant thing to offer." He said, "I don't offer things I don't mean." She believed him. She believed him completely, which was itself unusual enough to be worth noting. And she said, "I would appreciate that very much," and meant every word of it. The school board meeting on Monday was held in the back room of the courthouse, in a space that smelled of sawdust and new plaster from the construction, and had too many people in it for the chairs available. There were 5 members of the school board, 3 men and 2 women, and there were several community members who had apparently decided their presence was required, including Reverend Prout and Hazel Drew, who sat in the corner with a notebook and her professional expression on. Georgia sat at one end of the long table and the school board sat at the other, and she felt the familiar quality of being assessed, which she had felt in so many rooms in so many towns, and she sat straight-backed in her chair and waited for it to begin. The chair of the board, a man named Gerald Marsh, read relevant portions of the letter with the careful, slightly embarrassed neutrality of a man performing a duty he would rather not be performing. The letter was, as Georgia had known it would be, a masterpiece of insinuation full of implications that never quite became accusations, full of the kind of language that sounds like concern but functions as condemnation, and full of the very specific grievance of a man who had wanted something he had not been given and had reframed the denial as injury to his good reputation. Georgia listened to the whole of it without expression, and when Gerald Marsh had finished reading, she said, calmly and clearly, that she would like to address the board's questions one at a time, beginning with the specific claims made. She did this for 35 minutes. She was precise and honest and did not perform distress she was not feeling or confidence she did not have, and she answered the careful questions of the board with the same directness she brought to everything. And she watched, as she had watched before in similar rooms, the gradual shift in the quality of attention, the movement from suspicion toward something more complicated. Then Joel Archer, who had been sitting in the row of chairs against the wall behind her, and whom she had been fiercely aware of without looking at directly, said to the board that he would like to say something if they were willing to hear him. Gerald Marsh said that was fine. Joel said, "I've known Miss Winslow since she arrived in this town in July. I've spoken to her many times, at suppers and on the street, and on at least one occasion in a ditch, which I'll explain if anyone needs me to. I've watched her teach. I've watched the way the children in this town talk about her and look at her, and what they carry home from her classroom in their heads. I've watched how she conducts herself under the kind of scrutiny that would make most people buckle or perform. And I can tell you that what I've seen is a woman of genuine intelligence, genuine warmth, genuine integrity, and a degree of patience with small-minded people that is frankly remarkable." There was a silence in the room. He said, "I cannot speak to what Franklin Holt believes about her because I don't know the man and I don't know his reasons. But I can tell you what I've observed directly, and I've found direct observation to be more reliable than other people's letters." Georgia was looking at the table in front of her. She was looking at the table because if she looked at him, she was not certain she would be able to maintain the composure she had spent the last 40 minutes so carefully sustaining. The board deliberated for 15 minutes, during which Georgia and Joel waited in the room while the observers filtered out to give them privacy. Hazel Drew caught Georgia's eye on the way out and gave her the same small, private smile she had given her at Alma's supper, and Georgia held onto that like a railing. The board decided to continue her employment. Gerald Marsh shook her hand with the slightly awkward sincerity of a man who knows he has not been his best self in a situation, and is trying to indicate that he knows it without saying it directly, and Georgia received this with more grace than she felt, because grace was what she had. She walked out of the courthouse into the cool September afternoon and stood on the steps for a moment with her hand on the railing, taking 3 deliberate, quiet breaths. Joel came out behind her and stood a few steps down, his hat in his hand, and she turned to look at him directly for the first time since he had spoken. She said, "Thank you," he said. "You would have gotten there without me." She said, "Probably, eventually. You made it faster and you made it cleaner." He looked at her with that open, careful quality, and she thought that she had been so afraid of being seen clearly, and that right now she was being seen as clearly as she had ever been seen in her adult life, and she was somehow not afraid of it at all. She was instead something closer to relieved, the specific relief of setting down something very heavy you have been carrying so long you stopped noticing the weight. She said, "Would you like to walk a while? I find I need to walk a while." He said, "I'd like that," and put his hat back on, and they walked. They walked east out of town to where the prairie opened up and the grass ran long, and the sky performed its extravagant Kansas display. And they talked the way you talk when you have been through something together, and the formality of newness has burned off, and what is left is the actual substance of 2 people. She told him about St. Louis. She told him about Franklin Holt, the actual story of it, how she had been 23 and working for his family, and he had been charming at first, and then controlling, and then, when she had refused to marry him, vicious in the particular way of men who mistake desire for entitlement. She told him how she had left, and how he had followed her in letter form to every subsequent place she had gone. She told him about the towns before Caldwell and what each of them had been like, and what she had learned in each of them. She told him these things without the performance of either tragedy or detachment, just with the simple clarity of someone telling the truth about their life. Joel listened. He listened the way she had observed him listen at Alma's table, with his full attention and without reaching for the response before she was finished. And then he said quietly, "That's a hard road to have traveled." She said, "It's the road I had." He said, "You're very steady. I noticed that the first time I saw you. You were standing in the middle of a street covered in dust in a town full of people who had already decided things about you, and you were steady as anything." She said, "I noticed you too. You were in the livery doorway. You were looking at me differently." He said, "I try not to decide things about people before I know them." She said, "It's a remarkable habit." He said, "You said remarkable and terrifying the first time I saw you, in your face. I couldn't hear it, but I could see something like it." She stopped walking and looked at him. The sky behind him was enormous, and the grass was moving in that long, wave-like way, and the late afternoon light was doing something extraordinary with the color of everything. She said, "You're very observant." He said, "I'm very interested." And there it was, direct and simple and without performance. in the way she had come to understand was simply how he communicated. She felt it move through her like warm water. She said, "I am also interested. I want you to know that, because I've found that honesty used consistently tends to go better than its alternatives." He smiled then, and it was the first time she had seen him smile fully, and it changed the whole character of his face. It made him look younger and warmer and very nearly delighted, and it did something significant to Georgia Winslow's composure that she thought she was going to need to take a long time to fully understand. He said, "Good. I'm glad we've established that." She said, "We've established it." They stood there in the prairie grass with the enormous sky above them, and both of them knowing that something had begun. And Georgia thought that she had come to Caldwell to teach school, and she had taught school very well, and that was still the whole of her professional ambition. But that life had a way of expanding beyond ambition into something warmer and more startling, and she was going to have to be brave enough to let it. October settled over Caldwell with its particular golden light, and Georgia settled into the town with something that felt increasingly like belonging. The school board incident had done a strange thing. By being addressed directly and publicly, it had cleared the air in a way that slow rumors never could have, and the people who had been cautiously watchful of her began to inch closer, the way animals approach a fire once they have decided it is not dangerous. Ellen Prout began stopping by the schoolhouse on Fridays to bring cookies for the children and to stay and talk with Georgia afterward. Hazel Drew offered Georgia the opportunity to write a monthly column for the newspaper about education and childhood, which Georgia accepted with genuine pleasure. Margaret's children began spending Saturday afternoons at Georgia's room at Alma's, where Georgia told them stories and let them help her grade papers, which they considered an enormous privilege and which she used to excellent pedagogical effect. And she walked with Joel Archer. They walked on Sundays after church, when the town had its weekly pause from industry, and sometimes in the early evenings during the week when the days were still long enough. They walked east and west and north along the creek that ran behind the school, and they talked with the gathering ease of people who have discovered that conversation with this particular person is one of the better uses of time available to them. She learned things about him that added up to a picture she found more interesting the more complete it became. He had grown up in Missouri. She had not known that. They were practically neighbors in the past, in a farming family of modest means and 7 children, of which he was the 4th. He had left when he was 19 to find work further west, had spent 3 years cowboying in Wyoming, which he described without romance as very hard work in very cold weather with very unpredictable cattle, and had then spent a year in Colorado working in a mining town, which he described in even less romantic terms, before finding his way to Kansas. He had learned horses from a ranch foreman in Wyoming who was the most patient man he had ever known, and he had learned most of what he knew about people from the same man. She said, "He sounds like someone worth knowing." Joel said, "He passed away 2 years ago. I think about something he said most days." She said, "What was it?" He said that most of the time if you pay close enough attention to what something actually is rather than what you expect it to be, you'll be surprised in a good direction. Georgia thought about that. She said, "I think I've spent most of my life paying attention to what people expect me to be rather than the other way around." He said, "I know. It's a different kind of attention and it takes a lot of energy." She stopped walking and looked at him. She said, "How do you know that?" He said, "Because you're tired in a way that doesn't go away with sleep. I've watched it on you. And because it makes sense, if you've spent years navigating other people's prior conclusions about you, you'd have to spend most of your energy watching their faces rather than looking at the world around you." She stood very still in the cool October air. She said, "That is one of the most accurate things anyone has ever said to me." He said, "I've had a lot of time to pay attention." She thought she might like to take his hand then, and she thought that this impulse was relatively new. She was not, as a general principle, a person who reached for contact easily, and the fact that she was having it told her more than she needed to be told about the current state of her internal landscape. She did not take his hand. They walked on, but she felt, walking beside him, the particular quality of being accompanied that was so different from being alone that it almost made the solitude of the previous years a physical thing by contrast. November came, and with November came the first serious cold, and Joel Archer arrived at Alma Bridger's door on a Saturday morning in early November with a length of particularly good rope that he said the boarding house's clothesline needed, and Alma received him with an expression of great satisfaction and put coffee on, and the three of them spent a comfortable hour in Alma's kitchen with the stove going, and Georgia thought that this specific arrangement of people and warmth and coffee in a warm kitchen, with the cold pressing against the windows, was as close to home as she had felt in a very long time. 2 weeks later, walking back from the creek in the early dark, Joel stopped at the edge of the light from the boarding house windows and said, "Georgia," and she turned and he said, "I've been thinking about how to say something, and I've decided the most honest way is also the simplest way," she said. "That has always seemed right to me." He said, "I love you. I want you to know that clearly and without any confusion about it." She stood in the cold dark with the boarding house light warm behind her and the stars extraordinary above the flat Kansas prairie, and felt the thing she had been so carefully not naming for 3 months finally given its name by someone else, and it was not terrifying at all. It was the opposite. It was the profound, specific relief of a thing being true and said aloud. She said, "I love you too. I have for quite some time, and I've been very disciplined about it." He laughed, that full laugh that changed his face, and she stepped toward him and he met her, and when he kissed her it was careful and deliberate and warm, and it tasted of everything she had not let herself hope for. Alma Bridger, watching from the kitchen window with a completely unsurprised expression, turned back to her coffee and thought that she had the very best supper guest list in Caldwell County. Joel spoke to Georgia about marriage in December, not as a proposal exactly, but as a conversation sitting at Alma's kitchen table with Alma diplomatically elsewhere, with coffee and the last of Alma's preserved peaches between them, and he said that he had been thinking seriously about the future, and that when he thought about it, he thought about her in it, and that he wanted to know if she felt similarly. She said she did. She said it directly and without qualification. He said he knew it was not a simple thing, that she had a life here she had built carefully, and that he did not want to be the thing that disrupted it. And she said that love was not typically a disruption but an addition, and that she had been adding things to her life for 26 years, and she was reasonably confident she could add one more. He said, "I've been saving money. I've been thinking about buying the livery outright. Frank DuPont has been talking about selling for about 6 months. If I can make that happen, I'd have something solid to offer. I've also been looking at the land east of town. There are 3 parcels that would be good for a house and a small pasture." She said, "I intend to keep teaching." He said, "I know, I'd expect nothing less. The children of Caldwell would not forgive me." She said, "Also for my own sake." He said, "Also for your own sake, I know that too." She looked at him across the table and thought about the first time she had seen him in the livery doorway, the quality of being looked at without conclusion, and she thought that this had been the thing she had needed to find and had not known she was looking for, not someone who would accept her in spite of the world's opinions about her, but someone who had simply, from the beginning, refused to let the world's opinions precede her. She said, "Yes, Joel, to all of it." He smiled and she smiled, and Alma Bridger, who had returned to the kitchen doorway at exactly the right moment, and was fully aware that she had done so, said, "Well, that's settled then. Who wants more coffee?" They were married in March of 1884, which was still winter in the sense that Kansas winter was still cold in March, but the sky on the day of their wedding was that specific pale blue that comes just before spring, and the light had the quality of something returning. Reverend Prout performed the ceremony in the church, where Georgia had watched Joel sit in the back row on Sundays, and the church was full in a way that it was only full for the kinds of events that a town claimed as its own. The school children were all there, Robert Hatch in the front row with his grave, affectionate expression, and Hazel Drew and Ellen Prout and Alma Bridger in the second row, and Margaret and Tom and their 3 children taking up half a pew, and Mr. Goss with his good army posture and his funny way of expressing sincere feeling as though it were a military report. Georgia wore a dress the color of the pale winter sky and felt, standing at the front of that church, something that she had to identify carefully and precisely because she was a careful person with words. She felt right. Not happy, though she was happy, but right, in the specific sense of a thing being exactly what it should be. Joel stood beside her with his hat in his hands because you did not wear a hat in church, and he looked at her with the same open attention he had brought to every moment of their acquaintance, and she thought that this was what she was going to carry forward into every day after today. The particular experience of being looked at honestly by someone who had no prior conclusion to defend. They said the words that the ceremony required, and she meant every single one of them. Joel had indeed purchased the livery stable from Frank DuPont the previous January, and by March it was fully his, a solid business, well run, with a reputation built on the same qualities Joel brought to everything. The land east of town had taken a bit longer to sort out, but by the time the spring thaw made building possible, the paperwork was settled, and they had plans drawn up by a local man who built houses with the particular practicality of someone who understood that Kansas weather required walls to be opinions about permanence. Georgia continued at the schoolhouse. The school board, having gone through its moment of wobble and come out on the other side of it, was now apparently quite proud of her, which she found mildly amusing and entirely acceptable. She had 34 students by spring, as 3 new families had come in over the winter. Robert Hatch had developed an astonishing aptitude for mathematics that Georgia was carefully and happily cultivating, and she had already written to 2 people she knew in Kansas City about scholarship possibilities for when the time came. She and Joel built their house through the spring and summer of 1884 with the help of half the town, because Caldwell was the kind of place where people showed up for construction with their skills and their own coffee, and it was finished by August, a solid 2-story structure with a deep porch facing west, and a kitchen that got the morning light, and a parlor with enough room for the conversations Georgia intended to continue having in it. They moved in on a warm August evening a full year after Georgia had arrived in Caldwell with her carpetbag and her $32, and she stood on the porch in the last light and looked at the prairie rolling out to the horizon and felt the bigness of it not as a threat but as a gift. Joel came to stand beside her, and he handed her a cup of coffee, and they stood together in the quiet, and she thought that all of it had led here. Every town, every difficult room, every carefully navigated opinion, every mile of hard road, and she was not going to be sentimental about it because she was not a sentimental woman, but she was going to be grateful, which was better. She said, "It's a good house." He said, "It's going to be a good life." She said, "I know," and leaned slightly into his shoulder, and they stood there until the stars came out over the Kansas prairie, and she was not tired anymore in the way she had been tired before, not that bone-deep exhaustion of navigating a world full of conclusions about her. She was just a woman at the end of a good day at the beginning of a good life, and that was enough. That was more than enough. In the October of that year, Georgia told Joel that she thought she might be expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen on a Sunday morning with the leaves coming down outside the west window in the wind, and he set down his coffee cup very carefully, and then looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something wide open and bright that she thought might be the look of a man who has just discovered that the world contains more good than he had estimated. He said, "Are you sure?" she said. "Reasonably sure. I'll be more sure in another few weeks." He crossed the kitchen and took her hands in both of his and held them, and she looked at him holding them, and she thought about all the things that had had to happen for her to be standing in this kitchen in this house with this particular man holding her hands on this particular Sunday morning, and the improbability of it was staggering, and she loved it completely. She was sure within the month. The child was due in the spring. Georgia taught through the winter with her characteristic full attention, adjusting as needed as the months progressed, and she was honest with the school board about the situation, because she was always honest about situations, and the board perhaps improved by their experience of the previous year, and perhaps simply responding to the fact that it is very difficult to be small-minded in the face of Georgia Winslow's directness, agreed to bring in additional help for the spring term so that things could continue smoothly. Hazel Drew wrote a piece for the newspaper about the importance of communities supporting their educators, which was about Georgia without being about Georgia, and Georgia read it and felt that specific warmth of being understood by another person who has chosen to use their voice on your behalf. The winter was cold in the way that Kansas winters could be cold deeply, functionally cold, and Georgia found that she did not mind it because the house was well built, and the kitchen was warm, and Joel was good company in the particular way of someone who could sit quietly with you through an entire evening without either of you feeling the need to fill the silence, and she had not known before how much she had needed exactly that. They played cards sometimes in the evenings and read. She had accumulated a respectable library, and he was a careful reader who asked good questions about what he read and talked with the ease of people who had established that they were genuinely interested in what the other one thought. Alma Bridger came to supper on Thursdays. Margaret's family came on Sundays. The house filled with people in the way of a house where people are made to feel that their company is genuinely welcome, which it was. The baby came in April, as the first warm weather was tentatively making its case against the winter, in a process that was long and difficult enough that Georgia spent a significant portion of it thinking extremely clear and comprehensive thoughts about the nature of endurance. And at the end of it, there was a boy small and startlingly loud and possessed of a full head of dark hair, and a quality of immediate, absolute presence that Georgia felt she recognized. Joel held his son with the same careful, deliberate attention he brought to everything, and Georgia watched him from the bed where she was recovering, and she thought that her son had been born into hands that would look at him with openness before conclusion, and that was the best gift she could imagine giving anyone. They named him Henry, after Joel's father, who was still alive in Missouri, and received the news with a letter so warm and so full of incompetent spelling that Georgia read it twice and kept it. Henry Archer grew with the particular speed of babies that is both too fast and exactly right, and the months that followed his arrival were full in a way that Georgia had not known months could be, full of the small, enormous work of a new person in the world, full of the adjustments and discoveries that came with being 3 where they had been 2, full of the particular quality of joy that is also exhausting and is all the better for it. Georgia returned to teaching in September, with an arrangement that she had negotiated with the school board that gave her flexibility in her hours, and she brought the same full attention to her 34 students, 35 now, with a new girl named Patience who had arrived with her family from Nebraska and who reminded Georgia slightly of herself at 7, and life settled into the rhythm of its new shape. By the following spring, the spring of 1886, their lives were woven so completely into the fabric of Caldwell that Georgia sometimes tried to remember the precise quality of that first afternoon, the dust, the carpetbag, the string of settled opinions all around her, the man in the livery doorway. And she could remember it clearly, but it felt at the distance that good memories feel when you are far enough into the good thing that followed them. Henry was walking by then, unsteadily and with enormous conviction, pulling himself up on the legs of the kitchen table and the porch railing, and occasionally on the leg of whatever large, patient animal Joel had brought near enough for Henry to express his interest in. Joel had a way of introducing Henry to the horses that was exactly what Georgia would have predicted, slow and careful, with the steady voice and the patient explanation, as though Henry understood every word, which she was becoming increasingly convinced he did. Robert Hatch, now 11 and taller than he had been and sharper in his mathematics than Georgia thought she had ever seen in a child his age, had taken to coming by the house on Saturday mornings to do his extra work, and he treated Henry with the slightly serious affection of an older child who has decided a younger one is worth his attention, which Henry responded to with complete delight. Georgia watched all of this and thought that communities were built from exactly these kinds of threads, these small, specific attachments that accumulate into something you could actually live inside. On a May evening in 1886, with Henry asleep upstairs and the prairie performing its full spring display of wind and light and a sky so full of stars it seemed almost excessive, Georgia and Joel sat on the west-facing porch with coffee and the quiet that they had made a practice of, and Georgia said, "I've been thinking about something." Joel said, "What are you thinking about?" she said. "When I came here, when I first arrived, I was so afraid of you." He turned to look at her, surprised in the small way he allowed himself to be surprised. He said, "Afraid of me," she said, "not of you exactly, of what you were, of the fact that you hadn't decided anything about me yet." I'd spent so long learning to navigate what people had already decided that the absence of it was the most disorienting thing I'd encountered. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I remember watching you on that street. I thought, there's a person who knows exactly how to carry herself in a room that's working against her. And I thought that seemed like too much work for too long, and I wondered what she was like when she didn't have to do it." She said, "And," he said, "and I found out. I've been finding out ever since, and it's the best thing I've found." She looked at him in the May evening light, this man who had looked at her first with nothing but open attention, and she thought that she had been remarkable and terrified in equal measure by the gift of it, and that the terrifying part had long since given way entirely to the remarkable part, and that she was going to carry that forward into every year they had, which she intended to be many. She said, "I love you, Joel Archer." He said, "I love you, Georgia Winslow Archer," and she found, as she always did, that he gave it her full name in both its forms, because he was the kind of man who knew that a woman did not stop being who she had been when she became who she was, and that this seemed to him both obvious and important. The stars came out over the prairie, and Henry made a small sound upstairs, just the sound of a sleeping child shifting in his sleep, not the sound of waking, and Joel glanced up at the ceiling of the porch with the automatic attention of a new father, and she watched his face do that thing it did when he was listening for whether he needed to act or whether everything was all right. Everything was all right. The summer of 1886 was a kind one, warm without the brutal edge of the summer Georgia had arrived in, wet enough that the prairie was green longer than usual, and the town of Caldwell continued its self-building with the particular energy of a place that had decided on its own importance and was going about proving it. The railroad spur that Joel and Georgia had discussed at Alma's supper came closer to becoming real, with actual surveyors appearing in late July and generating a great deal of excited speculation in the newspaper and on every porch in town. Hazel Drew wrote 3 pieces about it, each more enthusiastic than the last. Mr. Goss expressed measured optimism with the authority of a man who had learned not to assume that things were going to go well, but who very much hoped they would. Reverend Prout prayed about it, which Georgia thought covered the necessary spiritual bases adequately. Joel said the railroad would be good for business, said it in the measured way of a man who was willing to be glad about a thing without building his plans on it before it was certain, and Georgia thought that this particular quality of hopefulness calibrated with honesty was one of the things she loved most consistently about him. She also, that summer, discovered she was expecting again, and told Joel on a July evening on the porch, and his response was the same as before, the careful setting down of whatever he was holding, the very wide expression, and then the taking of her hands, but there was something additional in it now, the warmth of a man who already knew what this meant in practice and welcomed it anyway, which she thought was the truer form of the response. Henry approached on the subject with the limited vocabulary available to a 15-month-old, responded to the concept of a sibling with the profound indifference that was probably appropriate for a person whose understanding of time was still largely theoretical. Georgia taught through the fall and into the early winter until December, when she handed her class over to a capable substitute the school board had found in a young woman named Alice Fordham, who had just come down from Wichita, and who Georgia evaluated with a thoroughness that Alice later said had been the most interesting professional experience of her career. The second child arrived in February of 1887, on a day when the cold was fierce and the sky was white with it, and this one was a girl, smaller than Henry had been, with Georgia's dark eyes and Joel's expression of immediate, intense appraisal of whatever she was looking at. They named her Clara, after no one in particular, and for no reason that could be exactly articulated except that it seemed to fit the quality of presence the girl arrived with. Henry, introduced to Clara with Joel's patient narration of what was happening, regarded his sister with great seriousness for approximately 2 minutes, and then went back to his block building, having apparently filed her under the category of things that were here now, and needed to be accommodated into his established understanding of the world. Alma Bridger arrived with more preserved peaches, and the patchwork quilt from George's old room at the boarding house, which she presented with the manner of someone returning something that had always belonged to the right person. Georgia unfolded it and laid it over Clara's cradle and thought about the woman who had sat on the edge of that bed and let out 3 months of held breath, and she thought that she would like to go back and tell that woman one true thing, which was, "You are going to be all right, more than all right." The school board, by the time Georgia returned to teaching in April of 1887, had apparently concluded that whatever arrangements were required to keep Georgia Winslow Archer teaching in their school were worth making. And so they made them, and she came back to 36 students, and 4 months of accumulated work that Alice Fordham had conducted admirably, and documented with the systematic precision of a woman who had clearly been raised by people who kept good records. Georgia shook Alice Fordham's hand and meant it, and Alice went back to Wichita with a letter of reference that Georgia knew would serve her well, because Georgia did not write letters she did not mean. The years moved forward in the way that good years move, with enough variety to stay interesting and enough continuity to stay warm. Robert Hatch, at 13, had demonstrated the kind of mathematical ability that Georgia had been cultivating since he was 9. And she wrote to the Kansas Agricultural College in Manhattan about him. A letter that was specific and persuasive, and pulled no punches about what she believed Robert Hatch was capable of, and received a response that said they would be very interested in speaking with the young man when the time came. She showed the letter to Robert on a Friday afternoon and watched his face go through several expressions very quickly, and then she watched him go very still in the way of a child who has just understood that something is actually possible that they had only been allowing themselves to approach sideways. She said, "You're going to need to keep working. You're going to need to do things that are uncomfortable and difficult and far from what you know, and you're going to be fine." Robert said with his grave, careful courtesy, "Because you think so," she said, "because you're capable of it. I've been watching you for 4 years. I know exactly what you're capable of." He nodded once, in the way of someone receiving important information and filing it carefully, and went home, and she had the deep satisfaction of a teacher who knows she is watching something good take shape. Henry Archer grew into a child of enormous curiosity and moderate caution, who had his father's quality of careful observation, and his mother's quality of not being easy to divert from a thing once he had decided he was interested in it. By the time he was 3, he was following Joel around the livery with the seriousness of professional dedication, and Joel explained what he was doing at every step with the same full-attention patience he brought to everything, and Henry listened and tried things and was not always successful and kept trying. Clara grew into her immediate intensity with the full force of her personality, which was considerable, and which Georgia recognized with equal measures of delight and resigned amusement. She was 2 when she began to be fully verbal, and the full verbal version of Clara Archer was something that the town of Caldwell was going to have opinions about for years to come, and Georgia could not wait for all of it. On a Sunday in October of 1888, 5 years after Georgia had first arrived in Caldwell with her carpetbag and her letter of introduction, she sat on the porch of her house with Henry on one side of her, and Clara on the other. Henry, 5 years old and very responsible about it. Clara, 3, and very certain about everything, and watched Joel come out of the stable across the yard where he had been seeing to a mare who'd had a difficult night, and she thought about time. She thought about how time had a way of compressing and expanding at once, so that the 5 years behind her felt both very long and very brief, like a country you had traveled through quickly but thoroughly, the kind of travel that changes you even when you can't exactly name where the change took place. Joel came to the porch and leaned against the post and accepted the cup of coffee she held out to him, and Henry immediately began telling him something detailed and earnest about a beetle he had found near the water trough, and Clara said that she had also seen a beetle, and that hers was better, and Joel listened to both of these accounts with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, and responded to both children with complete seriousness, which was what they deserved. Georgia watched him, as she often watched him, with the particular pleasure of observing someone being entirely themselves in exactly the right situation. She thought about the man in the livery doorway, the openness of it, the patience, the refusal to conclude before the evidence was in, and she thought that he had not been performing anything that first day. He had simply been who he was, and who he was the kind of person who looked at things honestly before deciding about them. And she had come from a world so full of prior conclusions that this simple quality had been the most remarkable and the most terrifying thing she had encountered. It was not terrifying anymore. It was home. It was the man across the porch taking a question from his 5-year-old son about the beetle with complete seriousness, and redirecting his daughter's competitive beetle commentary into a conversation about what beetles actually did for the soil, which Henry found interesting and Clara found slightly less interesting than being right, but accepted as a reasonable consolation. It was the porch and the prairie and the enormous Kansas sky doing its autumn thing with light and cloud, and the sound of Caldwell going about its Sunday business in the near distance, and Alma Bridger's flour on the kitchen table because she was coming for Thursday's supper, and Georgia was going to make the apple cake that had become the standard for such occasions. It was this, all of it. That evening, when the children were in bed, and the house was quiet in the particular resting way of houses that have been full all day, Georgia came to stand beside Joel in the kitchen where he was finishing the last of the coffee, and she said, "I have something to tell you." He looked at her with that open attention. She said, "I'm expecting again." He set the coffee cup down with the same careful deliberateness as before, and then he looked at her, and she watched his face move through the same sequence of expressions, the widening, the brightness, the warmth of a man who knows exactly what is coming and finds it worth the fullness of his welcome. He said, "Another," she said, "another." He said, "Henry's going to be very serious about it. Clara's going to claim she had the idea." She laughed fully, with her whole chest, because this was exactly right and they both knew it. And Joel came and put his arms around her, and she leaned into the solidity of him, and thought that she had never in her life thought she would be standing in a kitchen in Kansas, with 2 children sleeping upstairs and a third on the way, and a man who looked at the world with open eyes. And that the fact that she had been wrong about what her life was going to contain was the best and most complete surprise of her 26 going on 31 years. She said into his shoulder, "We're going to need a bigger kitchen table." He said, "I'll build it in the spring." She said, "Of course you will." The third child arrived in the high summer of 1889, in weather that Joel said was fine. Weather for a baby, and Georgia said from her position of direct experience, was an opinion held exclusively by people not doing the work. But it was fine. It was more than fine. It was a boy who arrived with the same quality of immediate loud opinion that Clara had arrived with, and who subsided into quiet examination of the room around him with Henry's quality of careful curiosity, and who seemed to have been furnished by the universe with both qualities operating simultaneously, which Joel said was going to be interesting, and Georgia said was going to be extraordinary, and they were both right. They named him Samuel, and Samuel James Archer was brought home to a house that received him with the wholehearted welcome of two older siblings who had been thoroughly prepared. Henry, with his responsible older brother Gravity, and Clara, with the authority of a person who had decided that this baby's arrival was largely her accomplishment and was prepared to manage him accordingly. Alma Bridger, who had become the kind of beloved presence in the life of the Archer household that made the word neighbor inadequate, who was more like family in the fullest and most chosen sense, came and brought the best chicken broth in Caldwell County, and sat in the kitchen rocking Samuel and talking to Georgia with the companionable ease of women who have worked out all the necessary distances and none of the necessary closeness. She said, at one point, holding Samuel with the practiced confidence of a woman who had raised 5 children of her own and had been present at the arrival of most of Caldwell since, "You've made a good life here, Georgia." Georgia said, "I have." Alma said, "I knew you were going to when I saw you that first day. Margaret had told me you were coming, and I was prepared to take you in as a kindness, and then I saw you come in the door and I thought, this one is going to be fine. She knows who she is." Georgia said, "I'm not certain that was true at the time." Alma said, "That's the difference between knowing who you are and being confident about it. You can know it and still be uncertain. Most people who seem confident don't know at all." Georgia thought about this and thought it was possibly one of the most accurate things she had ever heard, and she filed it under the category of things she was going to eventually say to Clara when the moment was right, because Clara was going to need to understand the distinction. The railroad spur arrived in 1890, and true to Hazel Drew's predictions, it changed things not catastrophically, not overnight, but in the way of water on stone, steadily and irreversibly, the shape of the town adjusting itself to the new current. The cattle business was changing too, as the open range period was coming to an end, and fencing was changing the nature of the ranching that had defined the territory, and Caldwell was navigating the transition the way growing places do, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes with grace, always with the energy of a place that has decided it is going to exist. The livery business was good, and Joel had expanded it the previous year to include a small repair operation for wagons and equipment, which he ran with a young man named Davis who had come from Dodge City with good hands and no conversation, which Joel seemed to find acceptable. Georgia had 39 students by the fall of 1890 and had begun advocating loudly to the school board for a second teacher, because 39 students across 8 years of education was too much for one person to do as well as Georgia wanted to do it, and Georgia did not do things badly if there was any alternative. The school board agreed in the spring of 1891, and Alice Fordham, who had been back in Wichita and who Georgia had stayed in correspondence with, came back to Caldwell as the second teacher, and the two of them divided the students by age, and Georgia found that teaching the older children with full concentration was one of the great satisfactions of her professional life. Robert Hatch went to the Kansas Agricultural College in the fall of 1891, at 15 young, but the college had been persuaded by Georgia's correspondence and Robert's examination results that age was the least interesting thing about him. Georgia went to the depot to see him off, with Joel beside her and Henry holding her hand and Clara on Joel's shoulders, because she had refused to walk any more, and Samuel, at 2, on Georgia's hip. Robert shook Joel's hand with the gravity of a young man going out into the world, and then he turned to Georgia and he said, "Thank you, Miss Winslow," which was what he always called her even now, and she thought that was exactly right and perfect, and she said, "Thank you, Robert. Come back and tell me everything you learn," and he nodded once in his Robert way and got on the train. She watched the train go with the particular feeling of a teacher watching a student take the thing she gave them into the world, which was the closest thing she knew to the feeling of a writer releasing a piece of writing. You put something into it, and you gave it over, and then you watched it become what it was going to be in other hands, and there was grief and pride and satisfaction in it in approximately equal measure. Joel put his arm around her on the platform, and she leaned into him, and thought that the grief and pride and satisfaction were only possible because of everything that had come before them. The teaching, the knowing, the years of specific attention to a specific remarkable child, and that this was what she was for in the deepest sense, and she was grateful for it every single day. By 1892, the Archer household had settled into the life that Georgia thought it would have for a long time, the particular stability that is not stasis, but is the warm continuity of a thing that has found its form. Joel ran the livery with the same steady competence he had always brought to it, expanding slowly and carefully in ways that made good sense. Georgia taught her older students and argued productively with the school board, and wrote her monthly column for Hazel's newspaper, which had acquired a readership that extended well beyond Caldwell's immediate geography, and which occasionally generated letters from other places that Georgia found deeply gratifying. Henry, at 9, was everything she had seen coming: careful, curious, kind, with a quality of attention that she recognized as his father's, and which she thought was going to serve him very well for his entire life. Clara, at 7, was exactly what she had always been: intense, certain, extraordinarily bright, and possessed of an opinion about everything that she expressed with a directness that Georgia recognized as her own. Samuel, at 3, was becoming fully himself in the way that 3-year-olds become fully themselves, with enormous commitment and frequent surprise. She had a life. She had a life of such completeness and such specific, particular richness that sometimes, in the early mornings before anyone else was up, when she sat with coffee in the kitchen and the east window was doing its reliable morning thing with the light, she would try to hold the whole of it in her mind at once: the school and the students and the house and the children and Joel and Alma and Hazel and Robert somewhere in Manhattan with his excellent mathematics. And she could not quite hold it all because it was too large, and she thought that this was the best possible problem to have. The morning that stays most clearly in Georgia Archer's memory from all those years, the one she returns to when she is very old and is asked about her life, is one in the spring of 1892, when the prairie is at its extraordinary best, and the light is doing that thing that light does in Kansas in May when it seems to come from everywhere at once. She is on the porch with Samuel, who is building something complicated out of sticks, and explaining it to her in the very detailed language of a person who understands something completely, and is assuming his audience will follow. Joel is in the yard with Henry, who is learning to handle one of the younger horses in the methodical, patient way that Joel has always taught everything. Clara is inside doing something with chalk on the kitchen floor that Georgia is choosing not to investigate until she is ready to address it. And Georgia sits on the porch in the May light with her youngest explaining his stick architecture, watching her husband teach her son the patience that is the foundation of good work. And she thinks about the woman who arrived in this town with a carpetbag and a letter and $32, and a practice method for navigating a world full of prior conclusions. And she thinks about the man in the livery doorway with his open, unhurried gaze. She thinks, "I found the most remarkable thing possible. I found someone who waited to know me before deciding about me, and I was so afraid of it that I almost could not receive it, and then I learned to receive it, and my whole life opened up from that." She thinks, That is the thing I want to pass to every person I teach, and to every child I raise, and to every person I love. Not the absence of opinions. Opinions are necessary. They are how we navigate, but the willingness to let them form slowly, from the actual evidence of a real person, rather than from the accumulated sediment of what everyone else has already decided. She thinks, I came to Caldwell to teach school and I learned the most important thing here, which is what it feels like to be known honestly and to find that survivable and then wonderful and then necessary. Samuel says, Mama, are you listening? She says, I'm listening. Tell me about the sticks again. And he does, and she listens. And the prairie rolls out in every direction under the enormous Kansas sky. And somewhere in the yard Joel says something to Henry that makes the boy laugh. A clear, easy, happy sound, and Clara appears in the doorway behind Georgia with chalk on both hands and an expression of complete innocence that fools neither of them and never has. This is the life. This exact arrangement of people and light and ordinary extraordinary things. It belongs entirely to Georgia Winslow Archer, who came to it by the longest and most complicated road, and who is grateful for every mile.